Phil Kearns, welcome to Wexted Advisors podcast series, the World Cup, the third largest sporting event in the world, a huge presence on the sporting calendar, 90% ticket sales, the ability to add billions of dollars to the economy. How do you feel being involved?
I'm incredibly excited, Joseph Hayes from Wexted Advisors.
Thank you very much.
It's a massively exciting event for Australia, and I think, in fact, for the world rugby. It's held in iconic places. Tokyo, just recently, London. The great cities of the world host World Cups, and we're one of the great cities.
And you've played in two yourself, of course.
Played in a couple myself. Played in three.
Well, played in three
myself.
Yeah. 1-2.
1-2.
Gary Wetnock, Kearns is through. Phil Kearns is through.
Johannesburg, was also one of the great cities that we've held it in, and it's going to the US in 2031.
Yeah.
So it is a massively important global sporting event, as important as sport can be.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic thing for Australia to be part of, and at a time that our rugby environment really needs it.
Now, if we go back to 2020, I'm told that Hamish McLennan called you and you met at the Blues Point Hotel in inner Sydney, and he said, "I've got a job for you." What happened after that?
So there's a little bit of a backstory to that. As you will know, I went for the CEO job at Australian Rugby a little while back, and I let Hamish know that. And he said, "Okay, let's have a beer at the Blues Point Hotel." So we went and had a beer at the Blues Point Hotel, and he said, "I've got a better job for you." I went, "Okay, I'm listening," because I thought to myself, well, it better be a bloody good job, because the CEO job could be a good one. And so we had the conversation. He said, "I want you to lead the bid for the 2027 World Cup." And I thought, okay, I'm interested. And talked a little bit more, what does it involve? And at that point in time, a lot of politicking, going around the world, talking to world rugby leaders, and in fact, world leaders, and talking to them about voting for Australia and supporting Australia to host that World Cup in 2027. In terms of other bidders, there were a few. Russia was one, but they weren't realistically going to get it. The Middle East were bidding for it as well. However, how seriously, we don't know. But the thing that they always had more than anyone else was money. Which talks. And then the US were talking about running for 2027 as well. So there was other bidders, and then there was also talk that it's possible that the UK could launch another combined bid, but that was sort of on the back burners a little bit. So I'd say I wouldn't say we're exactly short priced, but we went in there with a good story. And so I said to Hamish, "Who do I report into?" And he said, "Well, I put a board together," which was a very impressive board.
Yeah, indeed.
And after hearing who was on that, the likes of Sir Rod Eddington and John Howard and others, and we'll talk about them probably a little bit later, but it was an incredibly impressive board. And I thought, I want to be part of this. And so that's what happened.
It was a dark time, though, for rugby. Do you think this was the issue, and was early in that new board's governance, which you spoke about when that spill went on? Was this the issue that made the difference early in that new board, do you think, pushing hard on this?
It's sort of separate from the day-to-day running of Australian rugby and how Australian rugby was going. However, it does have a major impact on how the future of the game will go, particularly financially for Australian rugby. It's a potentially a very large windfall for the game that we should nurture. We've had it once before and we blew that windfall. and now I've got the opportunity to do it properly again. And when you're talking about the calibre of the board that we had and Hamish and his vision at the time, then it is a defining moment for Australian rugby.
Actually described as schmoozing roadshow brief, travelling the world to cajole support amongst rugby's powerful blocks. Surely there was more to it than that. No.
Yes and no. Certainly there was a lot of work with state and federal governments in Australia. That was a huge part of it. It's also a big part around the legacy program. World Cup is very cognizant of the legacy program that's in and around the game for its growth. And then the politics isn't quite as simple as just going and have a couple of beers with a few blokes or women. It's a lot more involved in that. So the knowledge behind those things is really important. And if I hark back to the names on that board when you talk about, John Howard knows everyone in the world pretty much. Definitely the most respected living Australian Prime Minister without any doubt, and he's respected around the world. So you got that bit covered off and the politics covered off. Then you talk about Sir Rod Eddington and his business background in a number of areas, but his global reach in terms of, he was the CEO of Cathay, CEO of British Airways. He's on the News Limited board, the Murdoch family board, Asahi.
And that's what you need to impress people like Alan Gilpin, right? You need quality people like that.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the bid special and different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Olivia Worth and Elizabeth Gaines, you can't underestimate their business prowess and access to people, particularly, we want WA to be a huge part of the World Cup. So Elizabeth Gaines' connections over there are incredible. And then you look at Gary Eller and John Earls in terms of their rugby knowledge and, respect that they're held in around the world. And Gary's Indigenous background is important because that's a big part of our legacy program. And John Coates also on the board, and John knows everyone on the planet in terms of sporting royalty in terms of athletes, but also the important political figures in sport around the world and also world leaders. And John has access to those people. So it was an amazing board, and I'm very privileged to work with them. But each person had their little piece of expertise that added to the full story.
And on Coates and the Olympics, just on the selection process, and we've seen this change, I think, from what was traditionally a bid process to a consultative selection process if we look at the Olympics. So we're not seeing multiple bidders now. We're seeing people sort of tapped on the shoulder to take it a bit, ergo Brisbane.
To be honest, we don't really know the answer to that. I think the US was serious, but I think World Rugby were of the view, I think, and with the US agreement in the end, that they probably weren't quite ready from a rugby perspective for 2027, but their game in the US would have developed for 4 years after that. So I think that had an element. Russia was ruled out pretty quickly. I think in terms of the Middle East, just the practicality of playing in the heat and, the stadiums, and we saw with the soccer alcohol restrictions. Now, come on, we're talking rugby
Wouldn't
here.
work.
We're talking rugby here. But I think, we the thing that Australia is really good at, and we've proven this time and time again, but particularly from the 2000 Olympics and beyond, is we know how to run big global sporting events. We've had Commonwealth Games, we've had World Cup rugby, we've had Olympic Games, and all the other events, from the Tour Down Under, which is obviously a smaller one, but we know how to run events and run them really well. That was a massive part of our selection. The second part is our stadia. We have the infrastructure and good infrastructure in pretty much every state to be able to hold it. And Rugby World Cup, World Rugby, I'm using the old names. World Rugby have some criteria around the size of the stadia that there needs to be for semi-finals, finals, etc. And we tick the box. You know, there's not many places around the world that have 3 stadia that are over 65,000 seats. You might be able to go to South America and have some soccer stadiums, but you know, it's rare. You know, we've got amazing sporting infrastructure.
And well, that's true. And what else do you need in terms of accommodation? You spoke about pubs. We've got lots of pubs. The Brits have lots of pubs too, more pubs than us, but ours are bigger. And we've got lots of accommodation. So how important is all of that in the bid, or is that taken for granted?
No, it's not taken for granted. I mean, there's a reason why New Zealand will never get another Rugby World Cup.
Thank God for that.
It's just not big enough.
Yeah.
They don't have the accommodation. They don't have the size stadium. They don't have the population. They can't charge the ticket prices. And, you know, they're one of the great rugby nations.
And can you guarantee for our listeners they will never get another World Cup?
Well, no, I can't guarantee it, but I'd be pretty confident in saying that's the case. You know, and to a degree, that's sort of a bit sad. But, you know, we worked out when we were doing our modelling that if we gave New Zealand a pool, it would cost us somewhere around $250 to $300 million of lost revenue. So I did have a conversation with the CEO of New Zealand Rugby at the time, and he said, "Can we get a pool?" And I said, "Yes, if you give us somewhere between $250 and $300 million," which obviously is not quite practical. And so, but he totally understood where the situation was. And, you know, New Zealand's it's closer than Perth. So it's almost a home tournament.
And on money, so you raise $100 or $200 million from government. How does that bit work? How do people get close to ministers? How do you convince them that rugby union is worth supporting compared to all of the other demands that government get?
Well, so that's state and federal governments. We got some money from the federal government just to run the bid, to put it together and start to fund the legacy program. However, all governments, depending on the event, have their tourism bodies, and you know, we've got Destination New South Wales here, and they and Visit Victoria down there, and they have a formula for each type of event, and they expect a return on that. For sort of more minor events, they'll expect a return of, let's say it's, you know, for every $1 spent, they get 10 back. In other bigger events, for every $1 they spend, they might get 4 or 5 back. And that's the situation for us. So when you map out the number of people that will come from overseas, and they've got all the stats around how much money people spend on average when they come in from different parts of the world. It's not hard to do the math on the exchange rates. We're cheap for someone in the UK or the US to come out here. So that modelling is all pretty well accepted. So when we go to talk to one of the state governments, we say, you know, we have 3 categories of games: your A, B, and C category games. Your A categories, your New Zealand playing England. Your B categories, your Ireland playing Fiji. And your C category
probably a very good game, actually.
Probably a very good game. And your C category is Portugal playing USA. And which will be a full stadium anyway, just for that one. And then you put a package together and say, okay, we're going to offer you 2 category A's, 5 category B's, and 3 category C's. These are the crowds we expect it to attract, and where we'd like to put the games. We think it's going to generate X number of dollars for the economy, and they go and stress test all that. And as I say, they're well-known numbers. They're pretty well-known numbers. And then they come up with a price and they bid for that amount of games. Now, sometimes they might not want all of those games, or they might want to, you know, I'll drop a category Z and I want to pick up a category B, and there's a little bit of to and fro there. So the governments are very well aware of the tourism benefits that a Rugby World Cup or an Olympics or whatever will bring to the game. So it's real economic benefit. It's just not made up dollars.
So you break the champagne, we've won it. You're now on the board of the local organising committee.
Yep.
other than match selection, which we'll talk about, what else is the local committee focused on and doing? Which is a World Rugby Committee, as I understand it.
Yes, it is, and we're made up of 3 representatives from Australia and 3 from World Rugby. Brett Godfrey, myself, and Sir Rod Eddington are the 3 Australian representatives. We look after everything and sign off from the branding and the tournament logos and all that sort of stuff, through to the ticketing concepts, through to what grounds the games are played at, what the legacy program is going to be made up of around the country, how we get involvement in regional areas. So we cover a broad spectrum of stuff, the economic models of how the sponsorship works. So we're involved in that with World Rugby, television rights deals, all that sort of stuff that we're across. So it's pretty broad. It's quite interesting, and it's very interesting at the moment. I wouldn't say we're working flat out. The people behind the scenes are Chris Stanley and his team. Chris is the CEO. Chris Stanley and his team are working flat out. And but as we get closer to the tournament, it'll heat up. But no, I'm very privileged and very proud to be part of that team.
Well, what's your sense of the importance of all of this for regional areas? Will there be access for regional people? Will there be a regional grounds strategy?
Yes.
So a smaller ground strategy, I mean.
No, not for games.
Not for games.
So the couple of economic reality around that is in regional areas, you can't charge the ticket prices. They don't have the size stadia that we need and that World Rugby requires, more importantly. So they're probably the 2 most critical areas of why actual games aren't played there.
But we will be bringing 20 or 30 countries here.
Yeah,
so
I'll get onto that.
Yeah.
So the third bit is the more you move teams around, the more expensive the tournament is to run and the less money you make. So you just increase your costs. But in terms of getting regional involvement, most teams will come out here at least 2 weeks before the tournament and potentially a month before the tournament. We have a list of, last time I saw, was about 73 different regional towns across Australia that can host a team. And that's also based on a number of criteria, which includes having the hotels with beds big enough to be able to have someone like Eben Etzebeth, fitting in a bed. It involves distance from between gym, pool, training facility, hotel, and other stuff to do around town. So when you're talking about in New South Wales towns in particular that I'm thinking of, you could think of places like Orange, Wagga, Goulburn, Bathurst, those sort of larger regional centres. And you could go up into the Hunter, of course, and I'm sure some will want to go up into Byron Bay and places like that. But so all those places would have a story to tell. And in fact, in some of those, larger, and those 73 venues I talked about, doesn't include places like schools where you can, training. A lot of schools, we'll have a pool, we'll have a gym, and we'll have a rugby field that is suitable, and hotels not far away. So that comes into play as well. So there is been a very conscious effort to try and make the regions part of it. And again, depending on the team, some of them might want to, let's say they stay at Orange, they might want to fly in the day before the game into Sydney or Melbourne, play their game and fly back out, where they can be sort of left alone a little bit more and go back to a more relaxed setting. And that's up to some of the teams to do. So within a pretty short space of time, I'm talking the next 6 months, we'll be communicating and with the team managements to say, come out and start to do a recce. So that'll happen.
And with World Rugby, as I understand it, that there used to be an arrangement where ticketing and ticket revenue was granted to the host country, but now there's a revenue sharing arrangement with World Rugby. Is that how it works? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a different model than I've had before. It is more of a partnership model, which World Rugby wanted to move towards. There were a lot of iterations along the way. I think from memory, off the top of my head, we had about 8, maybe 9 different models of the way it could all work, and we sat down with World Rugby and worked out the best way that would maximise revenue as a whole, but also be generous towards the host country and World Rugby having a great return as well.
And what commercial areas are available for the game then? So broadcast, sponsorship, how does all that work for the benefit of the local game here?
Well, so all of that, the key area is ticket sales. There's no doubt about it. Global broadcasting is important. The thing that's been really encouraging is the amount of interest in sponsorship. So some of the sponsors that have previously sponsored World Cups over the last 1 or 2 have expressed extreme interest in being in Australia. The broadcast rights, the discussions, so we're still in very early days. The broadcasters have shown a lot of interest. When it comes to selecting finals, that broadcast influence is important, from a time zone perspective. West Australia's in a, really solid time zone for the Northern Hemisphere in particular. So all that comes into play, and then there's a revenue share, which I can't tell you about.
Well, we will never get the AFL away from Melbourne, presumably never really get the NRL away from Sydney. You have to be able to tell me that the final is going to be at the Olympic Stadium in Sydney.
I'm not at liberty to tell you that, Joseph, at this point in time. I will say that there are 3 venues that are all well known, and I touched on it before, that the final has to be held in a stadium of above 65,000 people. We got 3 of them. We got Perth, we got Melbourne, we got Sydney. All of them have their strengths, and the time zone for WA is very good. It's a new stadium. It's a fantastic stadium, and rugby's growing there. Melbourne, it's just got 100,000 people, and no other stadium in the country can fill that. I guess, can you get the ticket pricing there? Not sure, but that's all worked out via the whole lot of modelling that we've done. And then you've got Sydney at the Olympic Stadium out there, which I think is a terrific venue. But they've all got their strengths.
Now, I'm told again by Hamish that without you and Sir Rod, this wouldn't have happened. How do you feel about that?
I'm flattered that Hamish would say that. However, I certainly there is a bunch, apart from the board that I mentioned, who were fantastic. There were really 4 critical people that were sort of shared by RA, and towards the end pretty much worked for the bid exclusively. A guy called Anthony French, then there was Alicia Keogh, and she knows every blade of grass of every stadium in the country, because she's been and looked at them all and seen them and worked in them and knows them. Liz Manawati, who has looked after the marketing and branding side of things, and the Prince, who was our lawyer, and whilst he was based offshore, Paddy had a huge part to play in the negotiation and the documentation of the World Cup. And I touched on Frenchie up front, but his political knowledge and knowledge of the key people to get to in state governments around the country is phenomenal. And he's a very, very smart guy, and now out in his own business with Liz Manawati.
Final question. Tough times for the game in many respects in Australia. A big legacy issue for us, the World Cup. How important is this, if you reflect on where the game has been the last 5 to 10 years? How important is this, and the Lions Tour, in fact, in terms of re-establishing game credibility, and, importance of the game as a major sporting code in Australia?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of answers to that. As a economic backstop for the game, it's absolutely critical. World Cup and the British Lions should put us in a position to adequately and appropriately fund the game for a long, long time. So it is critical, and I don't want to underplay those events. The most important thing is to win. And we've just seen the vibe of the country around rugby lift after 2 wins in the UK. Unfortunately, we lost against Scotland just the other night. But winning makes all the difference, and we do support our national teams like you wouldn't believe. And we have something that Rugby League and AFL don't have, and that's a national team that everyone gets behind, a real national team, like the Australian cricket team, and that everyone gets behind. And when that team wins, everyone talks about it. And, you know, mates of mine that are rugby league, crazy, all of a sudden are talking rugby again just after those 2 wins. So that is the most critical thing, because if the team wins, sponsorship comes in, television rights deals go up, more kids come and play the game. They have their heroes then, and Joseph Suwali, it was a great purchase by Hamish to get him on board. He's generated a huge amount of interest in the code for us. So, but at the end of the day, it's winning. If we win at the World Cup, then you put those 2 things together, that makes it even better.
Well, Phil, you've done it twice. You're a legend of the game. Thank you for speaking to us today. And we do hope it goes well. Congratulations on all the work you've done so far.